Okay, I can't take credit for the intro. Shoshana Baker wrote it, although the sentiments are definitely mine also. And so Rabbanit Shani Taragin is a noted author and teacher at Midreshet Lindbam, Midreshet Torah Avodah, Matan, Migdal Oz, Shalvim for Women, Landers College, and the Women's Bet Midrash in Efrat and Ramat Shiloh. She is also the co-educational director of World Mizrachi and a co-Rosh Bet Midrash with her husband, Rabbi Reuven Taragin, for the Bet Midrash program in Camp Moshava, IO. Through all these multiple positions and leaderships, Shani represents for us a religious role model who is dedicated and committed to the Jewish people and the world. On a personal note, Shani was both Shoshana and I first teachers to introduce us to the idea of Torah Eretz Israel. As you'll discover tonight, this style of learning is a different but vibrant and colorful format of learning, in contrast to that which we are accustomed from our upbringing. It's a real thrill. And lastly, a personal thank you to Shani for always saying yes and supporting the learning initiatives here in Netanya. Without further ado, votes in Shani.
Esty, thank you. And Shavuot Tov to everyone. And it really is a tremendous privilege and pleasure to be able to join in this wonderful journey of exploring different layers and methodologies of Megillat Esther. And on a personal level, not only a thank you to Shoshana and Esty for those beautiful introductory remarks, but really for the dynamic relationship in and out of the Beit Midrash, bringing and transforming Torah to a Torah Chaim. And I hope that each and every one of us have that opportunity to do so tonight, albeit I feel, as you'll see through the shiur, that I'm somewhat preaching to the choir. But as the point of the messages of Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim are in fact to bring these messages to life, then we're meant to ultimately share them with others. So I hope that you're going to feel very confident in this refreshing approach. I hope to Megillat Esther, that you'll then literally pay forward to others, and you'll see exactly which audiences I'm referring to. So without further ado, we're going to begin tonight. And I'm actually in the World Mizrachi building, and when they asked me, before giving my weekly shiur, what I'm teaching, and I said, I'm actually teaching Megillat Esther, and someone said, well, that's a little early, isn't it? And then someone else chimed in and said that she had been at a bakery today and they're already selling Oznei Haman. So as you see, the truth is that we're not too early, because we know that this Thursday we're going to be celebrating Rosh Chodesh Shvat, and Chazal tell us that Shloshim Yom Lifnei HaChag Shoalim B'Dorshim B'Inyanei HaChag. So already we can be in the Adar mindset as well. And that's why we're going to be exploring Megillat Esther, really the message and methodology in disguise. A little bit of a background, and I'm sure that you've seen this makor, the source, before, because Chazal are going to deliberate as opposed to many of the Svarim in Tanakh, for which it's very clear, not only Chamisha Chumshei Torah, but works of Nevi'im, that of course these are going to contain divine messages, and even with regard to Nevuah, relating to prophecies, national messages for the future as well, with regard to the Ketuvim, different messages that are attributed to various authors throughout history. Chazal deliberate with regard to some of them, what really is the basis for their canonization. And particularly with regard to the books of Shir Hashirim and Kohelet and Megillat Esther, these three in particular, Chazal are going to raise various questions. With regard to Megillat Esther, we're going to see that initially it seems that Chazal decided not to canonize Megillat Esther. And by this I mean that if the process of canonization, of deciding which works are going to be preserved for posterity by having Kohanim teach them in the Beit HaMikdash already during the time period of the Second Temple, and especially towards the end of the Second Temple, meaning by the 1st century BCE, we have recorded by Josephus even 24 books of what we call Sifrei Kodesh, 24 of the books of Tanakh. And yet, as we have unearthed and know by the 1940s with the discovery of Megillot Qumran, we have found in these wonderful Dead Sea Scrolls selections of 23 out of 24 of the books of Tanakh. The one that's blatantly missing, albeit some say maybe we'll find it one day, but the one of which we haven't found any sources is none other than Megillat Esther, corroborating the difficulty and maybe even the consensus amongst this Dead Sea cult. These Essenes, or really these Dead Sea priests, that they did not want to include Megillat Esther as part of the canon. And why is that? Well, we find recorded in Masechet Megilah some of the issues that are going to bother Chazal. For example, in Amarav Shmuel Bar Yehuda, here we're referring to even the Amoraim, who explain the difficulties as to why Megillat Esther should not be included. Shalcha lahem Esther l'chachamim. Esther wrote to the Chachamim. Now, this is a little bit of an anachronism, considering that Esther, as we're going to see, lives in the 5th, 6th century BCE, and we're talking about the Chachamim, basically the Tanaim, who are living closer to the 2nd and the 1st century BCE, so 300, 400 years later. And obviously, Esther is not writing this to Chachamim, and as much as they're hearing her echoes of Kivuni Lidorot, establish me, meaning establish my holiday for generations to come. And they explained to her, no, we don't really want to establish Purim because what will happen? You want us to celebrate, excuse me, a holiday. Sorry about that. A holiday wherein we're celebrating the defeat, basically, of the Jews against the Persians. That's just going to rouse anti-Semitism. We don't want to do that. So Esther, so to speak, responds, no, don't worry. Again, it's not going to rouse any anti-Semitism because it's already part of Persian history. They already know the story. So Rav Chanina, Rav Yochanan, Rav Chaviva matnu b'chulei seder moed ki hai zuga chalifa Rav Yochanan umayel Rabbi Yonatan. So let's put the question even aside of, again, recording this back and forth. So it seems that there's another version of this correspondence wherein Shachalahem Esther l'chachamim, that before we even raise the question of whether Purim should be canonized as a Jewish annual holiday, that really what was bothering Esther even more was kitzvuni lidorot. I want you to preserve my book that Mordechai and I wrote, basically canonize the book of Esther. Make sure that it's going to be perpetuated as part of the Jewish canon, as part of the literature that is going to be taught and is going to be read. Make sure that it's going to be preserved for posterity, lidorot. Shalchula, but no, we have a problem with canonizing Megillat Esther. Number one, they write to her, but Shalchula, hello, katati lacha shalishim v'lo rebbeim. They explain, no, they basically say that this is a story against Amalek, against Haman, and we find already that it's supposed to be written down, our war against Amalek 3 times and not 4 times, even though eventually they find a reason. Namely, you can say that it says in Megillat Esther, again, not just Kitbu, Ktov Zot, but also Ktov Zot Zikaron. So write down the words that we find in Sefer Shmot, and also in Sefer Devarim, and Zechron, and also in Nevi'im with Shaul and Agag, and Ktov Zot Zikaron Basefer. Maybe you can see Basefer as, okay, fine, a justification to write down an anti-Amalek story for the 4th time. And based on this, they decide in the end to canonize Megillat Esther. And clearly, Chazal are expressing their significant reservation in writing down the story. And we could all probably discuss on our own, and Chazal really do raise this, throughout the first 7 dapim or so of Masechet Megilah, various problems with the Megillah that indeed would preclude the ultimate consensus to canonize the Sefer. Can anyone tell me, for example, what you've always learned? Why is Megillat Esther a difficult Sefer for Chazal to include in Tanakh? And therefore, what this source in Megillah Daf Zayin is basically telling us is that, fine, Esther will include the Sefer, which I always say proves 2 things. Number one, that Chazal really did not want to include the Sefer a priori, but it also shows us that, again, if a woman pushes her way long and hard enough, then eventually she's always listened to. So good message for all the women out there. But obviously, a third message Chazal are telling us is that, albeit there are difficulties with the Sefer, obviously there's a significant reason, not just this allusion to this word Basefer, but there must be a reason why, despite the reservations of Chazal, they decided to include the Sefer. And this is exactly the point of our shiur. So first, let's go back for a moment. Can anyone remind us, what did we always learn? Again, starting, I'm going to say maybe even elementary school, why not include Megillat Esther? Why were Chazal very bothered? And not only by virtue of the fact that it may arouse anti-Semitism, or because it's written down already. We have enough Amalek stories. We have enough stories that tell us, yes, the Jews triumph against anti-Semites. And what bothered Chazal particularly about this story? So if you remember, Chazal are bothered both by virtue of the fact that the name of Hashem isn't mentioned at all, right? How could it be that we're going to include a Sefer in Tanakh that doesn't even mention the name of God? That's a very secular book, not a very religious book. Secondly, and we find that the story takes place, we're talking about a victory of the Jewish people living in Chutz La'aretz. So that's partially what I meant by, okay, I'm preaching to the choir over here. How can we include a story of the Jewish people, where the entire trajectory of Tanakh is about Am Yisrael developing as a nation in Eretz Yisrael? Thirdly, and in the end, Esther ends up marrying a non-Jew. This is so difficult. The Chazal are going to go out of their way to say, don't worry, first she married Mordechai, meaning they preferred to make her an Eshet Ish, already a married woman committing adultery with a non-Jewish king, other than saying that she only married this non-Jew because the story is taking place during a time where there's terrible assimilation. So you can imagine that this is anathema to Chazal, that the heroine of the story, it's almost as if teaching and broadcasting to the younger daughters of the generation that if you want to get ahead and you want to save the Jewish people, so I don't know, marry the president's daughter, or marry into the Persian kingdom. This is a very difficult message. In addition to all of these, then we also look at the story and we wonder, what's really the point of the story? We hear about eunuchs and tunics, and we hear about so many women in the harem. This is a story replete not only with primary, but secondary and tertiary characters that at first glance, it's really not clear why we need all this redundant, excessive information if the point is really only to tell us about the victory of the Jewish people. So why do we have also all these preludes into the story? So with these various expressions in the Sefer itself, we're going to now proceed and ask ourselves, what really is the message? When Chazal say, fine, Esther, again, we will canonize the Sefer. It's not just because Esther is pushing long and hard enough. It's not just because of her persistence, but clearly Chazal are telling us, okay, the Sefer requires us to truly probe the text itself and probe the context. And this is an imperative message of methodology. That is that when we approach any Sefer in Tanakh, it really is crucial to examine the text itself and to put it not only within the context of Tanakh, appreciating that we're talking about Ketuvim, that we're talking about a work written by the authors of that time, but also to put it in the context of history. And that's exactly what we're going to do now. And very often when we place a Sefer in historical context, we recognize that there are other messages. So let's go back even to the broader history, remembering that we're living under the Persians. That's the historical context of Megillat Esther that we hear already in the exposition of the first pasuk. So basically, the authors are telling us, if you want to understand the story, number one, recognize that we're talking about the time period of Achashverosh, Hamolech, Mehodu Be'at Kush, Me'asrim B'Sheva Medina. So go back to the Persians. In order to understand the Persians, you have to appreciate that the Persians, together with the Medians, are the ones who overthrew the Babylonian dynasty that ultimately began really in the year 605 BCE. For those who remember their famous wars in Carchemish in Syria between the falling Assyrian soldiers and the Egyptians who are vying for control over the ancient Middle East, particularly the Fertile Crescent, and all of a sudden Chaldeans who come from the southern Syrian desert to vie for control over the empire. And after 4 years of engaging in battle in Carchemish, basically from 609 or even from 612, but really from 609 to 605, albeit for the first 2 years, it seems as if the Egyptians are really going to have the upper hand. By 605 BCE, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of the Chaldeans, has basically vanquished the Assyrian armies and has warded off the Egyptian armies. And he goes back to the ancient city of Babylonia, rebuilds the city as his capital, and from here on in, they're known as Babylonians. And they decide, especially because Jerusalem is at the center of the world trade route between ancient Middle East and basically the Tigris, the Euphrates, and the Egyptian Empire. So immediately he strips the Judeans of control over the country, and for all intents and purposes, the empire, or basically what we call the loss of sovereignty for Jews, begins in the year 605 BCE. This is when Yirmiyahu offers his very famous nevuah of 70 years under the Babylonian Empire. He doesn't mean 70 years of living in the diaspora. He means 70 years of loss of sovereignty. And this begins in the 4th year of Jehoiakim, 605 BCE. It's not until 597 that we have the first of what we call the Galiot, the first of the exiles of the bourgeois of society, namely Jehoiachin. This is after Jehoiakim rebels again against Nebuchadnezzar. He's so confident that the Egyptians are going to come and overpower the Babylonians, but this time Nebuchadnezzar is able to prevent the Babylonians from crossing over the border, and Jehoiakim is killed. Jehoiachin, his son, continues the rebellion for 3 months, and then surrenders together with the upper classes known as the Harash and Masker, the artisans of Am Yisrael. Again, the bourgeois are all exiled to Babylonia, leaving the proletariats, leaving the poor indigent farmers in the land of Israel. And then, lo and behold, 11 years later is when they rebel following the siege of Babylonia. And ultimately, we have the destruction of Yerushalayim, the destruction of the first Beit HaMikdash, and then a mass deportation of Judeans to Babylonia, so much so that just as the respective prophets, Yirmiyahu and Yechezkel, have said, now the majority, or basically the Shvut Yisrael, those who are eventually going to return, the majority of Am Yisrael, basically, even though for the 11 years between 597 and 586, we have 2 potentially viable Jewish communities, one in Eretz Yisrael, the other one in Bavel. By 586, they're in Bavel. Not only that, there is the opportunity for a small community to retain settlement in Eretz Yisrael. That's going to end as well with the assassination of Gedaliah right after the destruction in 585 BCE. And then we see that as Jews are going to develop in Babylonia, then we have the release of the exile king Jehoiachin, and Jews such as Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah are successful in the king's court. And slowly but surely, it seems that there's going to be some level of assimilation, only to then have, take a look at 559 BCE, Cyrus the Great comes to at the Persian throne, and then together with Darius of Media, he conquers Babylon, according to, again, most historians, the last of the kings being Belshazzar. He establishes what becomes known as the Achaemenid Empire. And then just 1 year after that, in order to show that he's undermining the Babylonian political philosophy, he basically proclaims that all those who are exiled by the Babylonians are now allowed to return to their lands, rebuild their temples, and we're going to take a look at the terminology that he employs in what's known as Hatzarat Koresh, this famous proclamation of Cyrus, in addition to obviously wanting the Judeans and all those who were exiled by the Babylonians, not just the Jews, to go and to pay taxes and to ally themselves with the Persians. And sure enough, this is going to lead to the first aliyah of Sheshbatzar, and finally 535 BC, exactly 70 years to the date that Yirmiyahu had said that the people are going to reestablish sovereignty. They'll be under Babylonian rule for 70 years, and then they have an opportunity to return. And sure enough, we find that by 535, under Sheshbatzar and then under Zerubbabel ben Shaltiel, Jews return, albeit just a drop in the bucket. Only 42,360 Jews return. Now we're going to take a look, notice at the historical context. that's espoused by most historians, albeit Chazal, and we'll speak a little bit about this, place the story of Megillat Esther in a slightly different historical context. Because after Cyrus, his son Cambyses, who unexpectedly dies at a young age and is a very weak king, again leaves room for various revolts of, again, both Samaritans and even Judeans. And it's only Darius who is going to finally quell these rebellions, organizes what are called satrapies with satraps, governors, and he's the one who appoints Zerubbabel as the governor in Yehud versus appointing Sanballat, who is the head of the Samaritans, who basically are these assimilated Israelites who have married with Kutians that the Assyrians had placed there. So now we have Yerushalayim under Judean control and the rest of Eretz Yisrael as well. Only in 520 BCE do we have Darius allowing now for the official rebuilding of the temple. Even though Cyrus allowed for it, the Samaritans stopped the building of the temple with various political strategies and ploys. And finally, by 516 BCE, 70 years since its destruction, the temple is rededicated. Based on this historical data, we then hear after Darius. Again, this isn't Darius of Media, this is Darius the Great of Persia. After he allows for the temple, the second Beis Hamikdash, to be rebuilt, we then hear of a king Xerxes, who, as you see here, seems to be associated with Ahasuerus, not only because the Persian name Chishverash, Xerxes, is very similar to the Hebrew Ahasuerus, but also the Greek historian Herodotus describes the Achaemenid Persian dynasty as one full of lust for women and wine, which fits perfectly with the way that Shushan is described, with the harem and with the kelim shonim, and obviously a lot of drinking. Keep in mind that there are 10 parties, 10 mishtaot, mishta meaning shtia, 10 alcoholic fests going on throughout Megillat Esther. So this would be very indicative of this Persian king in particular. Again, namely Xerxes. Also, in the Babylonian city of Sifar, there was an administrative record that was discovered with the administration from the city of Shushan. And there was a Jewish treasurer by the name of Marduka. Sounds a lot like Mordechai, under Ahasuerus in Shushan. And finally, the only other biblical reference of a decree of Haman, or the decree against the Jews, is found in Sefer Ezra. And it talks about during the time of Ahasuerus. So the people, again, that means that Ezra lives after this king Ahasuerus. And sure enough, we're going to see how significant this is, because if he rules, as you take a look, starting 486, then in his third year, Bishnat Shalosh L'Malcho, we know that there was a tremendous victory of Xerxes against the Greek armada. The Persian fleet defeated the Greek armada. And then we have another king named Artaxerxes, Artaxasta, who in the 7th year, that's when Ezra and then Nehemiah later on will come back to rebuild Yerushalayim. And what do you know? We have many other kings. Xerxes means great, and Artaxerxes means the superior one. So then we have Xerxes the second, Darius the second, Artaxerxes the second, Artaxerxes the third, then the fourth, and Darius the third, who's ultimately defeated by Alexander the Great. And then we have the famous Battle of Asa, which is Tchilat Minyan Shtarot, when we start counting based on the Greek calendarical system. Now, why is all of this significant? Because when we put this in historical context, we begin with Vayhi bimei Ahasuerus. Who Ahasuerus? More often than not, then we find that stories in Tanakh begin with a historical exposition. Vayhi bimei, I'm thinking of the beginning of Yeshayahu. Vayhi bimei Uziyahu, Yotam, Achaz, Chizkiah. The Navi wants to give us the historical context so that we can better appreciate the messages. So he tells us, during the time of these Judean kings, Yeshayahu ben Amoz delivered his nivuah. Again, Vayhi bimei, again we have, again during the time, the years of Yoshiyahu, of Yoyakim, Yehoiachin, Sidkiyahu, Yirmiyahu is going to deliver his nivuot. Again, we have even you remember the opening to Megillat Ruth, Vayhi bimei Shvot HaShoftim. So we hear about what's going on. This is Shmuel Hanabi's way of telling us And do you remember the time of the Shoftim? It's a time of anarchy. So at the story, you have to understand in the time of the Shoftim, in the time of anarchy. And that's why there's a famine, because that's the barometer of a rift between God and the people of Israel. The reason why this is so significant is because we're not used to opening up a sefer in Tanakh, Vahi b'mei Achashverosh. Generally, all the stories begin in context of Jewish history, not in the context of a non-Jewish king. Again, even when we hear, for example, in Yecheskel, we hear it's the 5th year of Yehoiachin being in exile, meaning even when he is in exile, we're still counting according to our leaders. This is Mordechai and Esther's way of saying, yes, you should be caught off guard. In other words, if we're counting according to the non-Jewish king, then recognize that we do not have sovereignty. This isn't a time of an autonomous leadership. We are living under the time period, under the rulership of Achashverosh. That's like saying we're now living under the Trump administration. That says a lot, right? Basically, not making any political statements, but it is saying, okay, wait, that means that you're living in North America right now during very interesting times, as opposed to, I don't think any of us will say that, okay, we live under a Trump administration, we live under a Netanyahu administration, and that already associates us with not only our political affiliations, but our national affiliations. And that's exactly what they're telling us. Please put this back in the time period of Achashverosh, Hu Achashverosh, Hamolech Mihultavet Kusheba Vesrum Medina. And immediately I'm thinking 127. Oh, yes, I know that number. That's a member of Sarah. Again, but no longer is it associated with our matriarch. Now it's associated with a non-Jewish king. The Gemara in Megillah says that Rabbi Akiva was trying to wake everyone up, and he was trying to get their attention. And he draws associations between Esther and Sarah. And what does that mean? He was trying to wake everyone up. Not just that they were falling asleep, he's saying you're too passive and you're so assimilated. You're associating this number with Hodu and Cush and not with your own lineage, not with Sarah Imenu, right? That's like saying, I don't know, a number, I say the number 7 and I think of Shabbos. Someone else may say the number 7 and think of, I don't know, I'm making this up, like Shaquille O'Neal or some basketball player that carries the number 7. I have no idea whatsoever, by the way. Again, so someone can tell me who does carry the number 7, but actually I'd rather you not, because that means that that's your association, which is a very assimilated association. Now we understand this, that they're telling us, yes, and something happened. Chazal are going to tell us, wait a second, again, that's because Achashverosh married Belshazzar's daughter, Vashti, and his malchut is insecure. But now we understand his malchut wasn't secure, Xerxes, because he's coming after Darius. And there were many rebellions during this time. And the Greek armada attacked Persia. And basically, it's only in the 3rd year that he won this phenomenal battle of Salamis. And now he's going to make a very big party as a result. So we're going to see this even more and try to understand, wait a second, if we're living in the time period of Achashverosh, according to the historical context, then Achashverosh comes after Darius, who allowed for the rebuilding of the 2nd Beit HaMikdash. That means that he's living after Cyrus, who we hear in Ezra Parak Aleph allowed for Jews to go back to Yerushalayim, and as we said, both to ally with him, but also to fulfill the words of Yirmiyahu. The Jewish population was supposed to return to Eretz Yisrael by 535 BCE, and now it's 483 BCE. That somehow we've been living in Eretz Yisrael, or we've had this opportunity to return to the land of Israel already for 50 years, and yet we're going to hear about Jews living in Babylonia. And this is exactly what Mordechai and Esther are writing. Can you believe this, that there are Jews living under Achashverosh? When Cyrus was saying you should go back, live noblo bayit b'Yushalayim asher b'Yehuda, you should have gone back to fulfill the words of Hashem to Yirmiyahu, or in Divrei Hayamim, Bet Perek Lamed Vav, the very last few psukim of Tanakh. I love this. The very last word of Tanakh, as you see, is the word Vaya'al. Just in case you didn't get it from the rest of the Svarim in Tanakh, then this is the most Zionistic. Make Aliyah, make Aliyah. Make sure that you got that message by the end of Divrei Hayamim, when Koresh allows for the Jews to return to the land of Israel as a fulfillment of Yirmiyahu Parach Hey, who said that we're going to be under Babylonian regime and not have autonomy for 70 years. When we take a look at the Cyrus cylinder, this is a picture that was taken from the Cyrus cylinder in the British Museum. It really is only about this large. And here you see it somewhat magnified. Take a look at what's engraved, the original proclamation of Koresh. He attributes to his god, Marduk. We'll talk more about him, the king of the heaven and the earth. Told me, he basically had told me through the gods of Sumer and Akkad, and that these gods are very angry because Babylonia exiled them from their land. So I'm supposed to now return all those who were exiled by the Babylonians unharmed to their cells in the sanctuaries that make the gods happy. And this way, when the Jews, for example, return to their land and rebuild the temple, then every day Bel and Nebu will praise me, Koresh, and mention my good deeds, and say to Marduk, wow, Cyrus the king and Cambyses his son, wow, you should really help them, because they allowed for all these nations to go back and pay tribute to their respective gods. So here we see proof to the fact that, wait a second, Achashverosh comes after Darius, who comes after Cambyses, who comes after Koresh. That means that the story of Megillat Esther takes place when Jews are allowed to return to the land of Israel, and yet Achashverosh. They've chosen to remain in a Trump administration. They've chosen to remain on non-Jewish soil. They've chosen to remain in Galut during a time period, not only when they could return to Eretz Yisrael, but when there's a Beit HaMikdash. Could you believe this? That Jews are in Chutz La'aretz, not only after the establishment of autonomy in their state, but that in itself is hard to believe, but also once they have a Beit HaMikdash. So interestingly, Chazal actually adapt a majority of Chazal, albeit we do see this opinion based on, as you see, historical evidence, of which we didn't have so much of until I had to give credit to the British over here, who, as we know, in the mid-19th century, sent Kathleen Kenyon, for example, again, to the lands of Persia, and much of the excavations that were done, again, prove obviously the timing of the palace of Shusha, and the Persians, who were horrific historians, as opposed to, as we know, the Romans or the Greeks. Again, Persians did not document their history very well, and it took a while to put these different pieces together. But in the meantime, majority of Chazal actually adopt what's called the minimalistic approach, which is, wait a second, in Tanakh, I only hear of 4 Persian kings. I hear of Koresh, I hear of Achashverosh, I hear of Daryavish, and I hear of Artaxerxes. And not only that, it must be that Daryavish is last, because we know that Alexander the Great defeats Daryavish. Now, it's true, he defeats Darius III, but we only hear about one Daryavish. So Chazal, in their famous Seder Olam, attributed to the 2nd century to the Tana Rabbi Yosef Bar Chalafta, he writes about the background here of Megillat Esther, and says, in fact, that it must be that after Koresh allowed for the Jews to return to the land of Israel, and yet then comes Achashverosh, and we know that Ezra comes up during the time of Artaxerxes, who must be the one to allow for the rebuilding of the Beit HaMikdash, because Ezra already comes back and there's a Beit HaMikdash, but Daryavish is the last king, so it must be that Daryavish is Artaxerxes. So basically, there are only 3 Persian kings, of which we have Koresh, Achashverosh, Artaxerxes, Daryavish, wherein Achashverosh lives before there's the rebuilding of the Beit HaMikdash. So albeit, again, not such a significant difference, meaning it would place Achashverosh not in 483, but in 531, after Jews are allowed to return and establish statehood and establish autonomy, albeit still before the Beit HaMikdash, even though Chazal speak about the fact that, yes, the 70 years of Galut are up, and shame on the Jewish people for not returning to the land of Israel. So with this, we're now going to go back, and now appreciating this, we recognize a little bit as to how Megillat Esther is written and what Esther was in fact trying to impart to the Tanaim. Kitzvuni litorot. It wasn't just because of her persistence. She basically is saying, I know there are problems with this Sefer, but I want you to look very closely, because I'm telling you that there's a message here that you must pick up on. And it's a message, albeit in disguise, but one that is so important that I'm not willing to forgo for generations to come. And let's see what that message is. Not only by Bimei Achashverosh, can you imagine? Here's a story of Jews living during a time when they could come back to the land of Israel and reestablish autonomy, and they choose not to. But it's the time of Achashverosh Hamolech Meodu Be'ad Kush, and where Keshevet Hamelech Achashverosh Al Kisei Malchuto Asher B'Shushan Habira. The only other city, capital city, that's called Habira in Tanakh is in Divrei Hayamim, which basically is recording the events of the same time. Again, is Yerushalayim Habira, in reference to the city built by David and Shlomo. Basically, what are Mordechai and Esther writing? They're saying, shame on you for seeing your king as Achashverosh. Shame on you for seeing Habira as Shushan Habira. That's like the Meshach Chachma who said, oh, it's so terrible. People are calling Berlin Yerushalayim. People are calling New York Yerushalayim. Can you imagine? People are calling Shushan like Yerushalayim, Shushan Habira. We continue and we appreciate even more. And what else are they going to say? Again, what type of party is this that's going to continue, as we know, for 180 days? It's not just a drinking party, it's for the chil. He just defeated for now at least, the Greek armada, but he knows that he now has to start developing a strategy because we can be reattacked again. So he invites all of the, literally what we call today, Pentagon parties. So during the day, they're developing strategy. But at night, everyone ready for this? Baharoto et osher kavod malchuto. Vet yikar tiferet gedulato yamim rabim shmonim u'ma'at yom. Also fascinating, then that for 180 days, he's going to show off his kavod and tiferet. Wait a second, there's only one other place in Tanakh where we see the juxtaposition of these words, kavod and tiferet. And that's, as you see here, in source number 7, the big day kahuna lechavod u'tiferet. Chazal say, based on this, that Achashverosh actually donned the garments of the Kohen Gadol to say, you see, you're not going back to Yerushalayim to look at the Kohen Gadol. I'm wearing the garments of the Kohen Gadol. You're not going back. Not as a threat, in as much as literally Chazal are mocking Am Yisrael. You're looking at the palace of the king as kavod tiferet. You're looking at the fashion of Persia as if it's the epitome of glory. Instead of going back to the Beis Hamikdash, instead of going back to Yerushalayim Habira, you're looking at Shushan as if it's Habira. You're looking at the palace of the king as if it's the Beis Hamikdash. You're looking at Achashverosh as if he's the Kohen Gadol. Shame on you. And that's how Mordechai and Esther are writing the story. And not only that, let's prove it. They describe the entire Beis Hamikdash, and you can go to the Bible Lands Museum in Yerushalayim and see how, in fact, Achashverosh's palace in Shushan was modeled after Shlomo's Beit Hamikdash. And they go out of their way to describe how, yes, where is this party taking place? It's taking place b'chatzar ginat bitan hamelech. There's an outer courtyard, there's an inner courtyard, there is the place of the king, literally, lifnei hamelech. Wait a second, these sound very familiar to what we hear, not only with regard to the architecture of the Beis Hamikdash, but we open up Sefer Yechezkel, who talks about the model of the Beis Hamikdash, and he speaks about the Chatzar HaPnimi, and the Kodesh Kodashim, and the outer courtyard, which is the Kodesh, meaning all of these, again, are basically a reference to the Beit HaMikdash, and Hannah is correctly mentioning that Chazal say, wait a second, it seems that Achashverosh, the Midrashim say that Achashverosh held this party to mock the Jewish people. Oh, you thought your 70 years are up, but they're really not, because, again, look, you're still here. And according to Chazal and Gemara Megilah, it must be that Achashverosh counted incorrectly because he thought 70 years had passed and the Jews weren't returning. But now we understand that actually he's right, meaning that you could see it as a different counting. That's one possibility. But the pshat is really that he's mocking them. He's saying, wait a second, you're still here. And Chazal are saying, we were still in Galot. It's like, wait a second, you were supposed to be back, but you're still here. So shame on you, right? It must be that you're never going back. And Chazal tried to tell us, no, it must be he got the years wrong. But it really seems as if he got the years right, that they were supposed to return. And instead, they're so immersed in this culture of Shushan that they forgot about Yerushalayim. They forgot about this prophecy of the past. They forgot about their trajectory of the future. And Mordechai and Esther, now we see, are writing Megillat Esther as a satire. And we all know that the literature of satire is a way of mocking the audience without directly mocking them. It always reminds me, the first satire that I learned was my 8th grade English teacher, who provided us with a satire on the Democrats and Republicans. It was called Strange Bedfellows, about how donkeys and elephants can't get along, right? They again are having a difficult time with their toothbrushes, and they can't share an apartment. And obviously it's a satire similar to Animal Farm and communism. Now you could read the same book as again, think about Animal Farm. I could read it simply about the discussions going on, the power struggles between animals, and it will read fine, albeit when I appreciate the background of the spread of communism, all of a sudden I understand it with its greater political nuance. So too, again, I can understand Megillat Esther, but it really does seem like a strange sefer. That's why Esther says, but I'm telling you, Kitvoni L'Dorot. Look at the sefer and appreciate that we're writing it as a satire, that we're mocking the people who are still in exile, and that we're writing this as a reminder of the dangers of what happens when you start becoming so assimilated in the country and not returning to Jewish identity and Jewish statehood in the land of Israel. And therefore, to a certain degree, I always say it's like, putting a memory glass, or writing a burying a time capsule. And this actually once happened that my husband and I were invited to a certain young Israel, a shul, and it was Purim time. And I'm not going to say which one, but we came and my parents were watching our children. So I was able to get to shul early, and I see on the floor, okay, there are little pages of a siddur. So I put it aside to put in the geniza. And then I see another page on the floor, and I pick it up, and it says the 10 commandments of the shul. And commandment number 1, when people walk into the shul, all doctors have to sit in the first 5 rows, followed by the lawyers sit in the next 5 rows, and then the high tech sit in the next 5 rows. And I'm thinking, this is a very strange shul that I got myself into, but okay. And then it says to maximize conversation during Chazar Tashatz. Okay. Commandment number 2, all decibel levels must exceed 12 during Kriyas HaTorah. That's very loud. Why would they want people to talk during Kriyas HaTorah? Okay, number 3, again, commandment for the women. You must come in with bombastic hat designs to allow for sufficient, again, talking throughout the shul services. By then I realized that, and I go to the bottom, and then I see it says Happy Purim from the Gabaim. Right, that basically the Gabaim were making fun of obviously people talking about work and talking during Kriyas HaTorah, and the women just talking about what everyone else is wearing on their heads or not wearing on their heads, whatever the case may be. Then I was thinking to myself, oh my, I was about to put this piece of paper together with the siddur in the Geniza. Can you imagine what would happen 150 years from now? And they're going to open this up, and they're going to say, firstly, so strange that like their Sidurim with English translations. I mean, there was a time period when people needed English translation. They're going to think we're nuts. And then they're going to go through these 10 commandments, and not knowing that there were, generational phenomena of people talking in shul, because they wouldn't be able to imagine that people, spoke during Zman Tefillah. But they may really think that these are 10 commandments, unless you can put it back in the context of the generation. So when we put Megillat Esther back in the context of the generation, we can appreciate what a satire. They're mocking the Jews of Shushan for looking at Shushan as if it's Yerushalayim. They're mocking them for looking at the king as if he's God. They're mocking them for looking at, again, literally, for karpasu tchelet, all the different materials that are mentioned here with regard to the palace. Again, she's writing, and they're writing it as if it's the same materials of the Mishkan. And just in case you're not sure with the Kavod and Tiferet, we also hear, and Chazal tells you know what, read it to the tune of Eicha. Make sure you realize V'hashvot b'klei zahav b'kelim mikelim shonim. That Chazal say it must be that they were drinking from the vessels of the Beis Hamikdash that Achashverosh got from Koresh, who got them from Belshazzar, who got them from Bil Merudach, who got them from Nebuchadnezzar. In other words, they were looking at these kelim. They were looking at the Mekasa as if it was from the Beit HaMikdash. And Chazal tells this was definitely a problem. Again, that's what they're writing. Just in case you're not sure, Pasuk Chet says, V'hashtia kadat ein ones. And everyone, the rule is everyone has to drink, but we're not going to force you to drink because basically it's a culture of drinking. That's what Mordechai and Esther are writing about. Do you realize that everyone was in a culture of drinking? That's the culture. That's what defines the culture, that it was an inebriated culture. That's a very strong word because that's what the king founded. You generally don't talk about a law as something that's founded, something that's enacted. What is that based on? That we see here in source number 8. Chagai, the Navi who's living during the time of the rebuilding of the Beit HaMikdash under Daryavesh, writes about how it's a time of Yom Yusad Hechal Hashem, the day that the foundation for the Beit HaMikdash was founded, right? Basically, Mordechai and Esther are saying, look, the Jews in Chutz La'aretz, they're celebrating the founding of a drinking culture, instead of literally founding the basis of the Beit HaMikdash. But now let's continue. And we see, wait a second, why do we even need this Vashti story, right? So what many of us, we know, we need to hear how Vashti is going to be sent to the harem, and now there's a vacancy for queen. So why do we have to hear all the details? Remember the details of the story? A king invites his queen to come on the 7th day of a 7-day party after a 180-day party to show her off in front of all the other nations. So take a look at this. If it's a 180-day party, it's not just half a year. It's the time period between the two heads of the year, between Rosh Chodesh Nisan and Rosh Chodesh Tishrei. So if you have a 180-day party starting Nisan, that means it ends Tishrei. Anyone know of a 7-day party that's celebrated? Everyone ready for this? The 7-day party that's going to be celebrated, as it says, again, during these 7 days, Migadol Bat Katan Mishte Shivat Yamim B'chatzar Ginat Bitan HaMelech. A 7-day party for the closest ones in the courtyard of the king. I know the 7-day holiday of Sukkot. And if the 180 days begins in Tishrei, then how about the 7-day holiday of Pesach? Not only that, 7-day holiday of literally re-inaugurating the king. I know of 7 days of inaugurating the Beis HaMikdash in Nisan, and 7 days of inaugurating the Mikdash of Shlomo in Sukkot time. And wow, this is really fascinating. Again, mocking and saying, look, instead of celebrating the Shivat Yemei HaMiluim, and during Pesach or during in Nisan or in Tishrei, you're celebrating the 7-day inaugural party of Trump, of Achashverosh. So again, obviously Jonathan is saying, what were Mordechai and Esther doing in Shushan? How could they be critical of the people when they're guilty of the same mistake? That's an excellent question that we're going to relate to right now. In addition to, notice what they're writing then about this 7-day party. And on the 7th day, the king invited his queen to come and appear before him so that he can show her off to all the other nations. Wait a second, that's what God does. God invites us, his queen, to show us off in front of all the other nations. God says, I just want you. Right? Chazal speak about this all the time, and that's really our responsibility. Hashem says, now can you come so that literally in order to because we're beautiful. Hashem says, I want you to be my Or Laguyim. And we're wondering, like, why would Vashti say no? It doesn't make any sense. She knows her king. She knows that this is going to upset him. And yet, that's exactly what Mordechai and Esther are writing about us. Again, Hashem said, please come back to me so that I can show you off in front of all the other nations. I need you in my palace. Come back to the Beis HaMikdash. And for no good reason, we said no. So what does the king do? The king says, okay, so I'm going to banish you and choose Reuta Hatoba Mimena. And literally, I'll just choose another nation, or I'll choose those that are here in Eretz Yisrael, I'll choose someone else. And here's the proof. What are the letters that go out as a result? Again, the letters that go out seemingly are ridiculous. Here they are. The letters go out to teach all the people, everyone has to know that, yes, now we don't want anyone doing what Vashti did. Every man wears the pants in the family. Every man rules in their house. And if a Frenchman marries an Italian woman, they have to speak the language of the husband. Now, can we please remember that we're talking about the 5th century BC. This is pre-Betty Friedan and feminism. In other words, of course, the man was the ruler in the house. And of course, they would speak his language. This isn't a message for the Persians. Rather, Mordechai and Esther are saying, don't you get it? That if you don't listen to your king, really the ideal is, Kol ish sorer b'veito. Why are you staying here in Persia as third-class citizens when you can be first-class citizens in your national homeland, in the land of Israel? Why do you want to be voting in elections for, I don't know, the president of the United States when you can actually be running in your own Knesset? Why would you want to speak you should be speaking your own language. Why are you speaking, you name it, English, Spanish, Yiddish, when you should be speaking Hebrew? And here again, in a satirical manner, they're criticizing their generation. You didn't get this message? You didn't get the message of casting off the queen for not listening to her king? You don't get the message that you should restore yourselves to national identity? And therefore, indeed, all of this, the Shabbat Yemei HaMiluvim, why are you celebrating? So now we understand a little more as we continue. Ish Yehudi Haya B'Shushan Habira Ushmo Mordechai ben Yair ben Shimi ben Kish Ishimini Asher Hogla Yerushalayim. Let's take a look at this. Ish Yehudi, actually, he's not Judean because he's Benjamite. So why are we calling him a Judean? And the answer is because the Benjamites were exiled with the Judeans, and basically they're losing their tribal identity. And that's what happens when you're kicked off your homeland. Not only do you lose national identity, you even lose tribal identity. And we're going to prove in just a moment, even family identity, even personal identity, even your name. And not only that, but during the same time, there's another reference to an Ish Yehudi. The only other time in all of Tanakh that the term Ish Yehudi appears is in Zechariah, who's living during the time of Darius, living right before Achashverosh, who basically is saying, okay, once you build the Beit HaMikdash and all of you return, people are going to be so enamored by you, by the Jewish people in the Beit HaMikdash, that 10 Gentiles are going to hold on to the knaf of an Ish Yehudi, literally to the coattails of the Jewish person, saying, please take us Gentiles to the Beit HaMikdash. We want to follow the Jewish person. Notice what Mordechai is writing, Ish Yehudi Haya B'Shushan Habira. Instead of the Ish Yehudi leading the Gentiles to the Beit HaMikdash in Yerushalayim, there is a Judean who's in Gentile culture and living in Shushan. And what's his name? Mordechai. You're supposed to say, uh-oh, I know this name Mordechai. Mordechai comes from Marduk, just like Esther comes from Ashtart. Oh my gosh, that's like naming someone Christopher and Christina after the local gods. Yes, that's what happens when there's terrible assimilation. Don't worry. They also have their Jewish names, Chazal say Mordror and Hadassah. Again, I think I'm looking at peers over here and saying, I think most of us, I'm Shoshana, I'm Shani, but on my English passport, it says Shana Beth, which is very interesting because when I made Aliyah, I'm now Shana Beth. But putting that all aside, I asked my parents, why did you give me such an American name? They said, so this way, when you apply to Harvard, and they won't see you as so Jewish. And so many of us are like this. Again, that's exactly it. Look at the names. Wait, Mordechai is the son of Yair, who's the son of Shimi, who's the son of Kish, Ishimini. Kish is a very popular Benjamite name. Remember, Shaul's father's name is Kish. And Shimi, we see in Divrei Hayamim, is also indigenous to the tribe of Binyamin. Yair is in a Benjamin name. We see in Divrei Hayamim that every tribe had particular names that were very prevalent. Yair is Yair HaGiladi. Yair is a Menashe name. But that's what happens when you're exiled. you lose first tribal identity and then even family identity. Can you imagine? Yair has a son, Mordechai, whose name's such a non-Jewish name. And that's why Asher Haglam Yerushalayim. It doesn't necessarily mean that Mordechai was exiled. Kish was exiled from Yerushalayim and told his great-grandson, Mati, one day you're going to return, and you're going to return. And he lived with this dream of returning. Lo and behold, we find in Ezra that there really is someone from Binyamin named Mordechai and Ben Kish who returns to the land of Israel, who returns to Yerushalayim. So what's he doing back in Bavel? Hu ominat hadasa, because his bat dodo, his younger cousin, not his niece, his cousin lost her parents, and therefore either he's going as a shaliach of the Sochnut to go and inspire everyone else to make aliyah, and at the same time he's taking care of his cousin who's now orphans. And then we have a very and we see this, a very long chapter of a beauty contest. But if you look carefully, it's not a beauty contest at all. It's more like a concentration camp that girls are taken from the Ungschenplatz, every betula, and then eventually even married women, to go and literally entertain the king's court. And this is a terrible story. Not only that, they're just given tamukin. They're just given cosmetics. In other words, the goal is to starve them. And then they spend 6 months in oil and 6 months b'shemen hamor. Literally, again, they're basically being then one can even argue mummified, right? They're just going to be embalmed, right? They're treated as objects, which we know, if you go to the Persian room in the British Museum, you'll see, as opposed to the Egyptian room and the Greek room, where women also are portrayed as goddesses. In the Persian room, they're portrayed as little. The only time that women appear and at all are these little trinkets, literally these in the shapes of perfume bottles. So what's so significant about this? Again, look at this culture in which women are taken by force to concentration camps, and then they're going to be placed in this harem, and where who knows what will happen. And basically they're going to be starved to death. This is the end for Esther. And it's just remarkable how in the end she survives. Now, I don't know how many of you are convinced, and I'm just looking at the time, and convinced of these satirical messages. But I'll share with you that in addition to Rav Yoel ben Nun writing extensively on the topic, that really I'm going to say the most convincing argument for me was when you notice how many days, and even the Gzeirah is written, Haman Hagagi, he's the modern Amalek. If you look at the number of days that we live under the threat of annihilation, when Haman randomly decides, because that's how anti-Semitism works throughout the generations, and I think lately we've come to appreciate and be all the more sensitive to this message of anti-Semitism in Megillat Esther, that obviously Haman in the third year, right? The third year of Ahasuerus's reign is when the story begins. By the 12th year, within 9 years, we hear that he's willing to commit genocide. He doesn't even need to know who these people are. He just hears that there's an acham, mufuzar, mufurad, bein hamim, that they're so spread out, they're so assimilated. And they're not even really contributing to culture. They don't really listen even to their own God, which is indicative of assimilation. But what's remarkable is that we know that the Gezerah is going to be, the decree is enacted on Yud Gimel Nisan, right? That's when Esther fasts. And anyone remember when it's going to be repealed? It's repealed on Chav Gimel Sivan. That means for 70 days, the Jews live under fear of annihilation, under fear of genocide. By Chav Gimel Sivan, they hear that they can then defend themselves, and by then, Haman is going to be killed off, and the keys to his SS headquarters are given to Mordechai. But for 70 days, we fear complete annihilation and genocide. 70 days, wow. Yechezkel speaks about this phenomenon in Yechezkel Perek Dalet. He has to literally lie on his left side for 390 days, and then his right side for 40 days, to show Yom Lishana, Yom Lishana. 430 days basically to atone for 430 years of iniquity. Am Yisrael, if you remember, are going to have to to wander the desert for 40 years to compensate for 40 days of spying the land incorrectly. And so too, what do you think these 70 days of living under fear of genocide? You had 70 years that you were supposed to live in exile with the message that upon the conclusion of these 70 years, you were supposed to return to your land. If you didn't get that message, then Hashem is going to put you through a microcosmic exile. And now let's try this again. For 70 days, you're going to hopefully learn the message of not living under Persian rule, but rather returning to the lands. And that's why we see Yirmiyahu Parachav Tet, the significance of these 70. Again, now we turn to the very end of Megillat Esther. And the question is always by the end of the Megillah. So if Mordechai and Esther are indeed writing this as a satire, again, 70 also, that will depress you, Yafeh Ma'od. But if they're writing this as a satire, then did the people actually get the message? They end up laughing at themselves? Well, let's take a look. Mordechai and Esther, and they write about the victory. They write about, okay, you have to celebrate this. What do they initially, what's their message? Their message is, again, Kimu v'kiblu hayudim alehem. They accepted upon themselves. What did they do? They said, again, if Barack Obama wins the presidency, then, again, we're going to make Aliyah. I remember, by the way, my parents, in the 80s, right, when Jesse Jackson was running for vice presidential nomination, they said, if he wins it, we're going to make Aliyah. I remember the Friday before the Monday Democratic Convention, my parents took us to the post office to renew all of our passports, right? Or the embassy, wherever it was. Again, he didn't win and we didn't make Aliyah. And so that's exactly it. They said, yes, we're all going to make Aliyah al Zaram. You know what? We can, but our kids will make Aliyah. We'll send them to Bnei Akiva camps. And we're going to make sure to celebrate these days. And this way, what happens? In the end, people forgot why they were even celebrating. And it became all about, masks and partying. And they forgot. It just became a memory for their children. So what did Esther do? The very end of the Megillah, she writes again. Okay, second edition. Let's try this again. Why is Esther called Bat Abichail here? Because if you remember, Mordechai told her, she said, look, I'm putting my life on the line. He said, Esther, if you're silent, he says, don't worry, there's a population of 42,360 Jews in Israel. They'll be the survivors. But you and your entire legacy and your father's legacy is going to be lost. In other words, the Jews in Babylonia will be destroyed, but that's okay, because we always have the Jews in Eretz Yisrael. But now you have a chance of playing a role in Jewish history and the legacy of your forefathers. Sure enough, she does take a chance. She does put her life on the line. And that's why she maintains her father's legacy. And that's why Esther Bat Abichail, her father's name is mentioned. And she writes this, L'kayem, she says, look, I'm stuck here in the king's court, but all of you, again, I'm writing the story so that you realize the message. I'm rewriting this, a second edition, because you didn't get the message the first time. Don't stay here. Don't stay here in exile. I'm begging you. Again, l'kayem, you're supposed to do something. And what does she write? She writes, again, divrei hatzomot v'zakatam. She writes about the fast and their cries. And then it says, she writes, divrei shalom ve'emet, words of peace and truth. What is this a reference to? Words of peace and truth. Anyone who's living during that time knows what it's a reference to. It's a reference to what Zechariah wrote just a few years earlier, when Babylonian representatives or Persian representatives came during the time of Darius, during the time of rebuilding the temple, and they said, do we still have to fast on Tisha B'Av? And Zechariah says, yes. And it's not about fasting. It's about whether or not you've internalized the message. What's the message of the fast? That you have to come back here and build a society of peace and truth. And if you build a society of peace and truth in Eretz Yisrael, and he's talking to the people in Babylonia, who he says, again, you have to come here and build the society. And then not only will you not have fast days, but these days will be turned into days of joyous celebration. And this is what he calls Ha'emet v'Shalom Ehavu. This nevuah becomes known as the nevuah of Emet and Shalom. And basically, Esther writes Megillat Esther with an addendum of Zachariah's nevuah. And she's saying, now, this is exactly what Zachariah says. You have a chance of obliterating the fast days. You can come back, Ibn Ezra says, she's referring to, again, you can come back to Eretz Yisrael and not have fast days anymore and develop a society of proper values and truth and justice, or you can stay in Chutz La'aretz in a corrupt society and in an anti-Semitic society and keep fasting. And what do the people do? Again, the Megillat Esther is tragic. The people decide, no, it's okay. We'll stay in Chutz La'aretz. It's a little more convenient. We'll stay in Chutz La'aretz and we'll keep fasting. And that's why Ibn Ezra says it's a reference to all the fast days. And therefore, we're so upset while we're still fasting when we read Perek Yud, and it says, yeah, not much changed. In the end, we decided to stay in Chutz La'aretz, where we're still second-degree citizens, where we're still being taxed by the king. And Mordechai Yehudi, Mishnah LaMelech HaChashverosh, why does Mordechai stay in Chutz La'aretz? He stays as a Shaliach B'nai Akiva, and he says, if I didn't have an effect on this generation, then maybe Dober Shalom L'chol Zaro. Maybe I'll have an effect on the next generation. So the question is, why did Mordechai and Esther write this in a satirical manner for us to put back in historical context in order to understand it? Chazal tell us that, of course, they were trying, these are the messages of Nevi'im, come back to Eretz Yisrael, come back to Eretz Yisrael. The Gemara tells us that the reason why we had to suffer was because Mipnei Shenenu Misudato Shaloto Rasha, that we were so assimilated, and therefore you have to get the people sometimes to look at themselves and laugh at themselves. They didn't even appreciate how assimilated they were. The Gemara Megilah also tell us that, what do you know? Gedolah hasarat tavat yoter ma'arba'im v'shmona nebiim v'sheva nebiyot shetnabu lahem liYisrael. Because sometimes writing a story of threat of anti-Semitism accomplishes more than all the works of Nevi'im, which unfortunately we see today as well. And you could have B'nai Akiva, you could have religious Zionist camps and schools shouting at the place for Am Yisrael's in Eretz Yisrael. But somehow, sometimes October 7th, just again, a day of massacre can have that effect that years of a proper Dati Lu'umi education doesn't have. And that's why the Kuzari writes that, of course, it's so clear that God wants us in Eretz Yisrael. And 3 times a day we say, but we're really just like birds who are chirping it unless we actually make that move. So why was Esther so adamant about the Sefer being canonized? Because Esther realized that as long as Jews are still going to be in Chutz La'aretz, they're going to need to hear the story. They're going to need to hear about the dangers of anti-Semitism of the 1920s and the 1930s and 2024. They're going to need to hear the message of Purim to remind them. And Rabbi Yochanan says, at the time of Biat HaGoel, at the time of the next Beit HaMikdash, we're not going to need any of the works of Nevi'im anymore, because basically they're going to be fulfilled. And then he says, except for Megillat Esther, and we're still going to need Megillat Esther, which is so tragic. What is he saying? That even with Geula, and you're never going to believe it, there are still going to be Jews, even after we have a state of Israel, even after we have autonomy. Could you believe this phenomenon? There are still going to be Jews who will choose to live in Chutz La'aretz. And that's why we're still going to need Megillat Esther. I used to believe, okay, but then as soon as there's a Beis HaMikdash, of course, everyone's going to come here. And then you learn Megillat Esther and you say, wait a second, even after we have a Beit HaMikdash, people will pay ridiculous El Al flights to get to Israel. They'll pay, at the David Citadel, they'll pay whatever it is to stay there for Aliyah L'Regel. But then they're still going to get up and perhaps stay in their Shushan Habira palaces in Chutz La'aretz. And Esther writes, that's why Kitzvuni L'Tolov. Please preserve the story for generations to come, because there will be more Purims and there will be more Hamans. And there will be more assimilation, and there will be more October 7th. And the people are going to need to hear the story. So I always like to say, all of you in Netanya, in Yerushalayim Habira, in Eretz HaKodesh, if you're here, then you can really celebrate this Purim. But part of the message is for you to share this with all of your relatives in Chutz La'aretz. Give them a call, right now, and tell them, there's a message in disguise. That sometimes, and when we reveal the message, we appreciate exactly what Mordechai and Esther were coming to tell us. If you really want to celebrate Purim this year, and that's exactly what Chazal deliberate. And that they, in keeping Purim, they don't want to establish Purim. It's a Chutz La'aretz holiday. And they realize, wait a second, the only way that we can celebrate is if we turn this into literally, and instead of what Mordechai wanted, a 2-day holiday, no, it's a 1-day holiday. It's a holiday that you celebrate, again, like Eretz Yisrael, for 1 day. And the only place that you celebrate in Shushan are going to be walled cities from the time of Yehoshua, meaning remember that we conquered this country. It becomes really a Zionistic holiday. It becomes almost a prelude to Yom Ha'atzmaut. But if you're in Chutz La'aretz, then I don't know how much you can really celebrate. But what you can do is teach this message so that maybe this year, maybe the year that there is a bit of a sense of kimu v'kiblu, maybe people are willing to re-accept what truly HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants us to do, which is come back, build that society of Emet and Shalom, and then truly celebrate with the rest of Am Yisrael. Wishing you all a Chodesh Tov Umborach and Be'ezrat Hashem, a Purim Sameach, especially in Eretz Yisrael, but hopefully then the Jews, Yehudei HaTfutzot, will get the message as well.
Amazing, Shani. That's great. And especially we have a Purim Mishulash this year.
That's right. More time to get the message out. You should know, I wanted to, a few people have heard this, and I called Josh Bass, who's a relative, and I said, what do you think? Can we send like a podcast with a Nefesh B'Nefesh application, attached? He said, Shani, that's a little bit of religious coercion. I said, but that's Megillat Esther. Maybe we can disguise it somewhat, but Be'ezrat Hashem. So I'm going to go now to try to inspire the Mizrahi Shlichim over here to go and spread the message of Torah Eretz Yisrael with Yehudei HaTfutzot. So wishing you all a Chodesh Tov Umborach.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.